Leningrad. Winter, 1985. The apartment is small, crowded with 3 generations living in rooms designed for one. The walls are thin. The neighbors are close. Everyone knows that someone is always listening. But tonight, in the dim light of a single lamp, a family gathers around something forbidden. A television set, yes, but modified. Altered by a cousin who understands electronics, who knows which wires to splice, which frequencies to seek. The screen flickers with static, then suddenly resolves into an image that should not exist here. American television. The colors too bright, too saturated. The people too well-dressed. Their kitchens too large. Their problems too trivial. A sitcom about nothing important. About choices Soviet citizens do not have. About abundance that seems like fantasy. The family watches in silence, not because they believe everything they see, but because they have been told their entire lives not to see it at all. And that makes it irresistible. The father reaches to adjust the volume, keeping it low. The grandmother shakes her head at the excess on screen. The teenage daughter leans forward, transfixed not by the story, but by the glimpse of another world. A world she has been taught to fear and reject, now glowing in her living room in forbidden colors. This is happening in apartments across the Soviet Union, in Moscow, high-rises, in Ukrainian villages, in Baltic cities where the signals are stronger because they are closer to the West. Millions of people risking punishment, seeking truth or entertainment, or simply something different from what their government permits. They do not know it yet, but they are watching the erosion of an empire, not through military force or economic collapse, but through television signals that slip past borders like water through cracks in a dam. What Soviet citizens saw on those screens convinced them that everything they had been told was a lie. The story begins decades earlier, in the aftermath of World War II, when the Iron Curtain descends and 2 systems face each other across an ideological chasm. The Soviet Union controls information with the same ruthlessness it controls everything else. Newspapers print only what the party approves. Radio broadcasts only state programming. Borders are sealed, not just to people, but to ideas. The West watches this with a mixture of horror and determination. Because if the Soviet people do not know the truth, if they only hear propaganda, how can they make informed choices? How can change ever come? America decides to fight back with something the Soviets cannot easily counter. Not bombs or spies, but broadcasts. Radio waves that ignore borders, that penetrate walls, that carry voices speaking truths the Kremlin wants silenced. Voice of America launches in 1942, during the war, initially broadcasting to occupied Europe. But after the war, it finds a new mission, broadcasting to the Soviet Union itself, to Eastern Europe, to anywhere. Totalitarian governments try to control what their people hear and think and know. The early broadcasts are crude by modern standards. Shortwave radio, scratchy and unreliable. The Soviets jam the signals, filling frequencies with static and noise. But some programs get through. In the quiet of night, people turn their dials carefully, searching for that American voice cutting through the interference. The broadcasts are simple at first. News the Soviet press will not print. Interviews with defectors. Music the state considers decadent. But the message underneath is profound. There is another world out there, another way of living, and you have a right to know about it. The Soviets respond with fury. Listening to Voice of America becomes a crime. Radio sets are modified at the factory to to prevent tuning to foreign stations. The KGB monitors neighborhoods for illegal listening, arrest, interrogation, years in labor camps for the crime of curiosity. But the broadcasts continue, and people continue listening because prohibition makes information valuable, because humans are curious, because no matter how tight the control, some will always seek what they are forbidden to have. Through the 1950s and 60s, Voice of America becomes an institution. The signal strengthens. Jamming becomes less effective as transmitter power increases. More Soviet citizens risk tuning in, gathering in basements and back rooms, sharing what they hear in whispers. The content evolves, not just news, but cultural programming. Jazz, which the jazz ambassadors made famous in concert halls, now reaches millions more through radio waves. Rock and roll, which Soviet authorities denounce as Western corruption. Discussions of books banned in the Soviet Union, but widely read in samizdat editions, passed hand to hand. The Soviets cannot stop it. They try. They spend vast sums on jamming equipment. They prosecute listeners. They wage propaganda campaigns explaining why Voice of America is lies and provocation. But the signals keep coming, night after night, year after year. And then, in the 1970s, everything changes, because a new technology emerges that will make radio seem quaint by comparison. A technology the Soviets cannot jam, cannot block, cannot control. Television from space. The first communications satellites launch in the 1960s, orbiting high above the Earth, relaying signals from continent to continent. Initially, these are point-to-point systems. Television networks use them to send programs to their own stations. The signals are encrypted, controlled, intended for specific receivers. But the physics of satellite broadcasting has an inherent vulnerability. The satellites transmit powerful signals that cover enormous areas. Anyone with the right equipment can receive them, regardless of whether they are authorized to do so. The signals do not stop at borders. They cannot be turned off for specific countries. They simply radiate downward, indifferent to politics. By the late 1970s, Soviet citizens who can afford it begin acquiring satellite dishes. Not officially. The government forbids private ownership. But in a system where everything is scarce, black markets thrive. A dish can be built from scavenged parts. A receiver can be smuggled from the West or assembled from schematics, passed through underground networks. The first dishes appear on rooftops in major cities, crude, obvious, impossible to hide. The authorities crack down, confiscate equipment, find the owners. But for every dish removed, 2 more appear elsewhere, because word spreads about what these dishes can receive. Western television, not just Voice of America radio with its audio-only programming, but actual television broadcasts. CNN beaming news around the world, American networks whose satellite feeds can be intercepted, European channels broadcasting in languages many Soviets understand. And most revolutionary of all, the images are not just propaganda extolling Western virtues. They are everything. News reports showing Western problems alongside Western successes. Commercials displaying consumer goods in casual abundance. Entertainment that assumes viewers have choices, freedoms, options. Soviet citizens can only imagine. The impact is psychological and profound. Soviet propaganda has always claimed that Western poverty rivals Soviet poverty, that capitalism creates misery for the masses. But the television signals tell a different story. Even the poorest characters in American shows have possessions that Soviet middle-class families cannot access. Even the grimiest news reports from Western cities show infrastructure that works, stores that have goods, streets that are maintained. It is not that Soviet viewers suddenly believe America is perfect. The broadcast show crime, unemployment, social problems, but they show them in a context of overall prosperity that Soviet propaganda cannot explain away. If capitalism is failing, why do even struggling American families have cars and multiple televisions and refrigerators full of food? The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming, and it spreads person to person as those with access to satellite television tell others what they see. The information flows through informal networks, whispered conversations at work, notes passed between friends, a slow but unstoppable erosion of official narratives. By the early 1980s, the Soviet government faces a crisis of information control. They have kept their population isolated for decades, fed a steady diet of carefully curated propaganda. But now that monopoly is breaking down. Millions of citizens are accessing foreign broadcasts. And unlike radio, which can be listened to in secret, television is a social experience. Families watch together, neighbors gather. The forbidden information spreads exponentially. The authorities respond with increasingly desperate measures. They deploy detector vans that cruise neighborhoods looking for satellite receivers. They require registration of all communications equipment. They prosecute anyone caught with unauthorized dishes, imposing harsh penalties. But the technology is too cheap, too distributed, too easy to hide. Dishes can be disguised. Receivers can be moved. The cat-and-mouse game between authorities and citizens tilts toward the citizens because geography favors them. The Soviet Union is vast, the security services limited, and television signals are everywhere. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the situation is particularly dramatic. Finnish television broadcasts can be received directly without sophisticated equipment. Finnish and Soviet cities sit just across the Gulf of Finland from each other, close enough that regular broadcasts spill across the border. Tallinn becomes a city transformed by television. Citizens point their antennas north toward Finland and receive Finnish programming every evening. The shows are in Finnish, which most do not understand, but Swedish broadcasts also reach them, and many Estonians learn basic Swedish just to follow the programs. What they see is transformative. Finland in the 1980s is prosperous, peaceful, free. And Estonia, just across the water, is poor, controlled, grey. The contrast is undeniable because it is right there, on screen, every night. Two societies that were once similar, now divergent because of the systems governing them. Estonian teenagers grow up watching Western television. They see music videos, fashion, youth culture their parents never experienced. They form bands, imitating what they see. They adopt styles that horrify party officials. They dream of lives different from what the Soviet system offers. And they talk. In schools, in underground clubs, in samizdat publications. The information from Western television becomes ammunition in debates about the future. How can the Soviet system be superior when Finnish citizens obviously live better? Why does Estonia need to be part of an empire when Finland thrives independently? These questions have no good answers. Party officials try. They explain that Finland is small, that comparisons are unfair, that material prosperity is not everything. But their arguments sound hollow when juxtaposed with the evidence beaming down from satellites every evening. The same dynamic plays out across the Soviet Union, adapted to local circumstances. In Ukraine, dissidents use satellite television to record programs, then distribute VHS copies through underground networks. In Moscow, intellectuals gather to watch news broadcasts and discuss what their own media will not report. In Central Asia, even though Western programming means less to populations that do not speak European languages, the very existence of the technology demonstrates that control is slipping. Voice of America evolves alongside satellite technology. By the 1980s, it is not just radio, but television broadcasts too. VOA TV launches, specifically targeting audiences behind the Iron Curtain. The programming is sophisticated, professional, designed not as propaganda, but as journalism. News, documentaries, cultural programming. The goal is credibility, not persuasion. Let viewers see the truth and draw their own conclusions. The Soviets denounce Voice of America as psychological warfare. They are not entirely wrong. But it is warfare with an unusual characteristic. It uses truth as a weapon. The broadcasts do not need to lie or exaggerate. Simply reporting what is happening in the West, accurately and clearly, is enough to undermine Soviet credibility. The Reagan administration understands this. They pour resources into broadcasting initiatives, shortwave transmitters powerful enough to overwhelm jamming, satellite systems designed to reach Soviet citizens directly, funding for programs that mix news, entertainment, and cultural content to maintain audience interest. And they coordinate with other Western broadcasters. Radio Free Europe, operating from Munich, targets Eastern Europe specifically. The BBC World Service, with its reputation for fairness, reaches audiences who distrust overtly American sources. Deutsche Welle broadcasts to German-speaking populations. Together, these services create an information environment the Soviets cannot control. The impact extends beyond politics. Soviet citizens, watching Western television, absorb cultural information that changes how they see themselves and their society. Fashion evolves as young people imitate what they see on screen. Music tastes shift. Attitudes toward authority, toward work, toward personal freedom, all begin to change. The Soviet system is built on control of movement, of information, of thought itself. But television signals cannot be controlled. They flow like water, finding every crack, exploiting every weakness. And once people see what is possible elsewhere, once they know what they are missing, control becomes impossible to maintain. By the mid-1980s, Gorbachev comes to power, promising glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring. These policies are partly a response to the information crisis. Millions of Soviet citizens already access foreign information. Continuing to deny and suppress becomes counterproductive. Better to open up somewhat, to allow more honest discussion, to try to reform the system from within. But glasnost accelerates the very trends it is meant to manage. Once Soviet media is allowed to report more honestly, citizens compare it to what they have been seeing on Western broadcasts and realize just how much they were deceived. The gap between official propaganda and observable reality becomes a chasm. Soviet television begins showing programs that were unthinkable years earlier. Investigative reports on corruption, discussions of historical crimes like the Katyn massacre, debates where party officials are challenged directly. It is revolutionary, and it is driven partly by competition with Western broadcasts. If Soviet television continues lying, while Western television tells the truth, no one will watch Soviet television. The underground networks that once distributed Western programs adapt. Now they focus on the most forbidden content documentaries about Soviet history that official media still will not show. Programs about independence movements in the Baltic states, coverage of protests and unrest that state television minimizes or ignores. The technology keeps advancing. By the late 1980s, VCRs are more common. Programs recorded from satellite television can be copied and shared. Information flows become impossible to track, let alone stop. The KGB still tries, still arrests people, but they are bailing water from a sinking ship. And then come the revolutions of 1989, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. One by one, communist governments fall, and television broadcasts every moment. Soviet citizens watch the Berlin Wall come down on CNN, broadcast live via satellite. They see celebrations in Prague, protests in Bucharest, freedom spreading like fire. The contrast with their own society becomes unbearable. If all these countries can change, can free themselves, why not the Soviet Union? The Baltic states agitate for independence. National movements surge across the Soviet republics. The empire, held together by force and ideology, begins to fracture. Television does not cause the collapse alone. Economics, politics, military overreach, leadership failures all contribute. But television is the accelerant. It shows people what is possible. It breaks the government monopoly on truth. It makes resistance seem not futile, but inevitable. When the Soviet Union finally dissolves in 1991, satellite dishes are common across its former territory. The technology the KGB once fought desperately to suppress is now unremarkable. People watch what they want, when they want. The idea that government should control information seems absurd, a relic of a discredited past. Voice of America continues broadcasting, its mission evolved, no longer fighting a Cold War, but promoting democratic values and press freedom globally. The techniques pioneered to reach Soviet audiences now target other closed societies: China, North Korea, Iran. Anywhere governments try to control what their people know. The lesson of the Soviet experience is clear. In the modern world, information cannot be contained. Technology favors openness over control. Authoritarian governments can slow the flow of information, can make accessing it dangerous, but they cannot stop it entirely. And once people know the truth, once they see alternatives, maintaining control becomes exponentially harder. The satellite dishes that once symbolized rebellion are now everywhere, not just in former Soviet states, but globally. Communication technology has advanced beyond anything imagined in the 1980s. The internet makes television seem almost quaint, but the principle remains the same. Information crosses borders whether governments want it to or not. Today, authoritarian regimes still try to control information. China builds its Great Firewall. Russia restricts internet access and prosecutes dissent. North Korea keeps its population isolated from the world. But the technology keeps evolving, always staying ahead of the censors, always finding new ways to breach the walls, and the people always find ways to access it. VPNs instead of satellite dishes, encrypted messaging instead of whispered conversations. The tools change, but the human desire for truth, for connection, for knowledge beyond what authorities permit, that remains constant. The Soviet citizens who gathered around modified televisions in the 1980s, risking punishment to watch forbidden broadcasts, were pioneers of an information revolution that continues today. They proved that people will seek truth even when it is dangerous, that curiosity is stronger than fear, that no government can permanently seal its citizens away from the world. Their example resonates in every closed society struggling for openness, in every dissident risking prison to access forbidden information, in every citizen questioning official narratives because they have glimpsed alternatives. The broadcasts that crossed the Iron Curtain did not just entertain or inform. They demonstrated that the Iron Curtain itself was an illusion, that borders drawn on maps cannot stop signals traveling at the speed of light, that walls, no matter how high, cannot block ideas. This was the real power of Voice of America and satellite television. Not any specific program or message, but the simple fact of their existence, the proof that even the most totalitarian state cannot achieve perfect control. That information, like water, finds a way through. The Cold War is over, but the war for information continues. The technologies are different, more sophisticated, more powerful, but the stakes remain the same. Whether people have the right to know what their governments prefer to hide, whether information will be free or controlled, whether truth matters more than power. The satellite dishes pointed toward the west were not just receiving entertainment or news. They were receiving something more fundamental, evidence that another way of living was possible, that freedom was not just Western propaganda, but an achievable reality, that the Soviet system, for all its claims to represent the future, was actually a prison. And once enough people understood that, once the critical mass was reached where the secret was no longer secret, the system could not sustain itself. It collapsed not from external pressure, but from internal recognition that it was built on lies, maintained by control, that had finally been broken. The family in Leningrad, watching their forbidden television in 1985, did not know they were witnessing the beginning of the end. They just knew they were seeing something real, something their government did not want them to see, and millions like them, in apartments and homes across the Soviet Union, were having the same realization. 6 years later, the Soviet Union would cease to exist, and among the many causes of that collapse, alongside economic failure and political sclerosis and military exhaustion, was something simpler and more powerful. People knew the truth. They knew it because they had seen it, glowing on television screens, broadcast from satellites, indifferent to borders, carrying signals that could not be jammed or stopped or erased. They knew it because someone had decided that information should be free, that truth was worth broadcasting, that people had a right to see the world as it really was. The screens went dark when the Soviet Union fell, but what they had shown could not be unseen. What they had taught could not be forgotten. The knowledge that walls can be breached, that control is temporary, that truth eventually finds a way, that knowledge became permanent. In the end, television did not defeat the Soviet Union, but it showed Soviet citizens that defeat was possible, that change was coming, that the world they had been taught to fear and reject was actually a world they could join. And that made all the difference. If you are captivated by these stories, where technology becomes revolution, where forbidden information sparks change, where the simple act of watching television becomes an act of resistance, Then join us to explore more hidden chapters of how the Cold War was really fought. Subscribe to uncover the secret broadcasts, the underground networks, the technologies that crossed borders governments tried to seal. Because the Cold War was not just about missiles and spies. It was about information, about the battle for truth, about ordinary people risking everything to see what their governments forbade them to know. And those stories of courage and curiosity deserve to be told.